Hi, and welcome to this year's edition of Mental Festival Asia 2022. I'm Theodoric Chu, the co-founder and CEO of Intellect, and it's a pleasure to be here today to speak with everyone. I appreciate everyone taking time from your busy schedules to actually join us in this year's Mental Festival. A very brief note about who we are as a company. Intellect is a mental health technology company that provides mental health well-being solutions and support to workforces, individuals, employees all across Asia Pacific. Our mission and goal is simple. We want to change and reboot how mental health care is done in the region, where it's historically very stigmatized, taboo, and often hard to access as well. We believe that mental health support is needed for everyone, and everyone should get access no matter where they are on their journeys as well. Now, before we jump ahead into what this year's session actually is about, a very quick recap on what we did last year. In last year, 2021, Mental Festival Asia was a huge hit with many people across the region when we're in a pandemic and lockdown. We welcomed over 5,000 attendees and featured many notable speakers from CEOs, HR leaders, clinical professionals, government speakers, and many other experts to share about well-being and mental health from the public lens, as well as the private sector as well. So in this session, we're going way larger and bigger with a clear theme on pushing boundaries as well. We'll be featuring over 35 speakers in this edition, from notable founders and CEOs like Kwek Suri of Carousel, sports athletes and icons like Hua Tingwen, notable media personalities and actors like Jun Pang, and HR and industry leaders like Neil Narell of Mercer, Gilberto Keita of Google, and also importantly, ministers and public sector figures like Minister of State Sun Xueling as well. The goal and ambition for this session is that we want to touch on the theme pushing boundaries. Now, a bit of what the background of pushing boundaries is about. We believe that fundamentally, mental well-being and mental health, a lot of it revolves around boundaries, from our own boundaries, how we draw them, how we respect them, and this year, how we're going to push them further as well into positive action. A lot has happened in the past 2-3 years. And in this year, as we are quite quickly stepping out of the pandemic, there's quite massive changes as well in how we are behaving, how we're living, and how we're working. Now that there's quite a good amount of amassed awareness on mental health, we want to drive the next step, which is driving change amongst how we behave, how we live, and how we push mental health. This second edition of Mental Festival Asia will offer a wealth of insights and takeaways on how to build healthier homes, workplaces, and social circles all across Asia to become conducive environments for better personal well-being and, importantly, mental health. It will be a 2-day festival of in-depth panel discussions and talks by industry leaders, leading experts, and many notable figures, where we aim to both inspire people in organizations, government, the public, as well as drive actionable insights on how to push boundaries and drive action towards positive mental health. Now, with that introduction out of the way, I'm very excited to move into our opening keynote session. Today itself, I'm excited to welcome and have Minister of State, Ms. Sun Xueling, to join us here today. In this session, we will have Ms. Sun Xueling, who will shortly give an introduction, to have a welcome and opening keynote, as well as a fireside chat. Now, Ms. Sun Xueling is the Minister of State in the Ministry of Home Affairs and Ministry of Social and Family Development. She is part of the Interagency Task Force on Mental Health and Wellbeing and the Vice Chair of the SG Mental Wellbeing Network. She'll be able to share a whole mess of knowledge and perspective on how she and the government thinks about mental health in Singapore, as well as the public population. Welcome, Minister of State. It's great to have you with us today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me at the Intellect Mental Health Festival Asia 2022.
Great. So appreciate you joining us this year in our opening keynote session. We'll have a fireside chat this session. We'll keep it a bit more personal than otherwise more formal sessions. And we have a couple of questions laid out where we would love to get your perspective on mental health in the region, in Singapore, and also how you see things as well. So first thing to start things off, we like to dig a bit into the changes that happened over the past few years. So we've gone through and lived through the pandemic. A lot of things has happened over the past 2 years. So I'd like to ask you, Minister of State, in your view, has there been any change in sentiment on community mental health and employee well-being over the past 24 months from what you've seen? And also, as we look beyond the pandemic, if you could share a bit more about that.
In the past 2 years, I think because of the pandemic situation, a spotlight was cast on mental health. And that's because the pandemic has affected so many aspects of our lives. It has impacted people from different age groups, from children who faced difficulties because there are changes to their routine. In Singapore, there was a break of 2 months whereby the children did not go to school. They had to basically study, learn at home through the student learning space provided by the Ministry of Education. Parents were also under stress. Parents had to work from home. Parents had to juggle work from home while taking care of children who were spending a lot more time at home. And at the same time, they had to deal with a change in routine in the workplaces as well. That impacts both employers as well as employees, because employers have to get used to a new workplace arrangement where they are not seeing their employees perhaps as frequently as they would like to. And employees also perhaps suffer from what I mentioned earlier about having to juggle work and family commitments, while at the same time trying to retain their productivity at work. And generally, I think all across society, and this does not just impact Singapore as well, when people have less chances to get together, where social circles are limited because of COVID measure restrictions, we all know that people are social animals. We rely on each other. No man is an island. Friendships, family relationships, they're all impacted when we cannot see each other as much as we would like to. So I think the past 2 years, the COVID years, has definitely impacted mental health and cast a spotlight on it. But to look at it positively, when you cast a spotlight at something, and when you name an issue and you are able to identify it as a very clear and present issue, then I think everyone is a lot more focused in thinking about how to provide constructive solutions, how to co-create solutions. And it's with that backdrop that there was a call to action. The government set up the Interagency Task Force on Mental Wellbeing. I chair one of the subcommittees around that. And we basically launched a call to action. We asked many ground-up groups to come and provide their suggestions because, like I mentioned, so many different people from different age groups were impacted that it's not possible to have a one-size-fits-all kind of a solution. So it was a call to action for various ground-up groups to come together, present potential solutions, student groups, parent groups, workplaces, employers and employees, community social service agencies all chipped in. So I think for the past 2 years, that was that silver lining in the cloud, where people were a lot more focused on mental health.
Amazing. Thanks so much for that, MOS. I think that's a good point in terms of what has actually happened, and a lot of what actually we've seen impacting in positive ways, the change from in the individual level as well as from the government level, where you mentioned initiatives like the Interagency Task Force and a lot more efforts as well that are meant to drive not just ground up, but also country level solutions initiatives that would further the impact of mental health. So I think that's amazing. Thanks a lot for that. Now, moving on beyond what has changed over the past 2 years, wanting to dig one layer deeper into a bit of the conflict and issues that have arisen over what has happened, which has been a huge change in how we live and work. Now, according to a report done by industry leaders and one of our partners, Mercer, 1 in 5 Singaporeans actually feel de-energized at work, which is actually 2 times higher than the APAC average. Now, it's no surprising news that Singapore is a very productive and vibrant ecosystem that comes also with stress and other aspects as well. So this can have some implications to workplace productivity. What do you think are some of the contributing factors to this, and what are your thoughts around this?
I think there can be various factors to it. I think there are definitely physical factors that we have to look into. So for instance, whether or not there are excessively long hours at work, I think when people are generally tired, when you're feeling stressed, it impacts productivity, it impacts your mental health. So I think there are these physical hygiene type factors that we need to look into at a societal level, as well as at the individual firm level. It's often said that in Asian societies where the managerial style may be a little bit more command and control, that bosses, employers may actually have a preference for seeing the employee at work, whether or not the employee is being particularly productive. When you have a command and control type of a structure, sometimes you are at risk of micromanaging. Sometimes people talk about someone breathing over your shoulder. It can cause stress. Yeah. I think a term that has come on board recently is about how do you trust and inspire your employees rather than command and control. And if you just think about the words that are being used, right? Trust. When you trust someone and that person is not in view and in sight of you, but if you trust that person, you trust that employee, and you know that employee may be working from home, but he's committed to your company. So he will still deliver the results and the work that you desire from him, even though he may be out of sight, right? And inspire, how do you inspire as a leader rather than to control as a leader? So I think there are those factors that require us to have a little think about the type of workplace managerial type of strategies we have in workplaces. And then separately from that, we also should look at certain processes, HR processes. How are appraisals done? What is the culture in a company? Do employees talk to each other? How do people see mental health? There is another survey that was done, and this is done by the NTUC. They had a special report in 2021 on mental wellness, and I think 4 in 5 of the respondents shared that there was mental stigma associated with issues related to mental wellness at work. So I think when employees feel that they can't quite open up about some of the mental struggles that they may feel, then that in itself is another layer of stress over and above whatever stress they're feeling already at work. So I think these are some of the things that we need to look into. And finally, just a final point on stigmatization. I think this has often come up in the many conversations we've had across different age groups. Even students, young people, they say that they have concerns about talking to their peers, talking to teachers, to counselors, and talking about mental wellness because of mental health, because they're concerned about how people would view them, that you are seen to be weak. And that's why I think one of the campaigns we have rolled out is about it's okay to reach out. We have that as a tagline, as a slogan, to remind people that if you reach out for help, it's perfectly all right. People can have bad days where you feel down. And that when you reach out for help, everybody can become stronger together. I think that's what we're trying to emphasize in our society. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, MOS. I think that's an amazing perspective to have. You touched on a couple of very good points on the stigma in place that's been, I think, been around for a long time, but many efforts have been driven over the past 2 years and even beyond the past 2 years, but really taking the front seat over recent times in terms of normalizing conversations around mental health. I think one of the key things that fully align and believe in is that it's normal to speak out, and it's also oftentimes similar whereby what everyone's feeling, the same like you as well, good or bad. You're not alone in what you're feeling. So I think this campaign you just mentioned, it's amazing. And also briefly on the 2 points, I think you're right in terms of driving trust and inspiration. That's a big factor that workplaces need to have as well. Thanks so much for that. So that gives us perspective on the impact that has happened over mental health and what it implies to the workplace. We'd like to shift gears a little bit towards understanding the perception of how things are in Singapore itself. Just moving on to the next question here, the government has clearly stated the strong intent, and you've highlighted a couple of very clear initiatives to address the stigma around mental health and equip citizens with more actionable views to seek care for themselves or through peers as well. Can you share a bit more about how the government plans to further this and what plans around this, building off what you mentioned?
Thank you for the question, Theo. I had mentioned the Beyond the Label campaign, so that's a whole of society effort. Everyone can chip in. I think the message "it's okay to reach out" can apply to anyone, whether or not you come from a different race or religion or age group, gender. It's okay to reach out applies to everyone. But when we say that, I think it's also important that we have the appropriate receptacles when people reach out. So I think for most people, when you reach out, the closest, the most direct and immediate person you reach out to is someone around you. Could be someone in the family, a colleague at work, a classmate in school. So how do you create a culture whereby generally people are just a bit more aware about mental health, and what kind of skills should everyone be equipped with? It's actually not too difficult. Very simple skills like listening attentively, not being judgmental, yes, and recognizing signs of distress, symptoms of mental health, underlying mental health conditions, and then knowing how to bring it up to the next level. So for instance, if you know that a classmate is experiencing difficulty, it is one thing to be a good friend and to listen. But when you see symptoms and signs of depression or potential risk of self-harm, how do you escalate it to the next level? Bring it up, for instance, to the school counselor. Bring it up to a trusted adult. I think people who are listening and being that friend or being that family member needs to know, after someone has reached out to you, where is that channel of help that you next go on to escalate it to the next level. So another part of what the government is trying to do beyond the label campaign is to ensure that we have multiple channels of help. And one thing we're trying to do is that mental health and the related issues exist on a spectrum. There is mental wellness, mental health, perhaps mental illness, mental disease. If a person is not feeling mentally well, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're mentally ill. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go to the Institute of Mental Health and be hospitalized. I think that's one extreme end of the spectrum. And obviously, resources and adequate medical advice needs to be provided at that end of the spectrum. But I think that there are many people who are not at that end of the spectrum, but at the earlier stages, or perhaps what they do need is, as I mentioned, a listening ear, someone more like a counselor, perhaps a psychologist, before you get to the psychiatry part of it, you see. So I think it really exists on the spectrum. And what the government needs to do together with stakeholders in the system is to ensure that at every different stage on this spectrum, that there is adequate help that is being provided. So for instance, I mentioned, if it was just a classmate in school and it's just, a bad day in school, maybe all you need is a friend or a school counselor or a peer support group. It could just be quite well managed at that level. If you need to go beyond, is it a social service agency? There is Touch Community Services, there is Singapore Association for Mental Health, there's Samaritans of Singapore, even Intellect. I'm sure you have a wide network, of people who can provide some form of help at the community level. And beyond that, is it someone like a family doctor, who is able to prescribe some perhaps basic medication that deal with inability to sleep, for instance, or a relaxant. So it doesn't just at one shot you go to the Institute of Mental Health, which creates an issue not just from the perspective of creating a sense of stress and anxiety to the individual because you feel that you're mentally ill right at the set-go. And also because we do not want a situation whereby you end up having a bottleneck at the hospital end. Because if everybody is trying to get to the hospital when actually you don't need hospital care, then you may have an issue at a hospital level because you have not enough beds. And to be honest, that kind of intervention may or may not be what the individual needs.
Thanks so much for that, MOS. I think that's a critical point you highlighted, which is really important, and one that we always like to bring up, which is that mental health is on the spectrum. Like you just mentioned, it's not just black or white. A lot of times we're somewhere in the middle, in the gray, with very fluctuating needs depending on what we're going through. So exactly to the point, there need and should be relevant interventions based on what the person is going through. And it's amazing to hear what some of the initiatives that the government has been driving across the full spectrum. So thanks a lot for that. We've got two final questions for this session, but really insightful to hear what you've shared so far, MOS. So the second last question here, it's a bit more towards a deeper one step towards, I think you shared greatly about the community efforts from peers, for students, for youth and schools. If we were to look at the workforce as well, what would you think are ways that business owners, managers, executives, and people managers altogether can actually effectively nurture a culture where mental health support is accessible and also, I'll say, less stigmatized today? What are some thoughts there?
Thanks for the question. I think we often hear from employees or people who are juggling, just the term juggling itself. It's like work-life balance. When we use the word juggle, right, it's because we're trying to keep all the balls in the air. And but I was thinking that, because of COVID, so many people are now able to work from home because that flexibility has somehow found its way into our consciousness. Work arrangements have changed because employers have had no choice but in the past 2 years to sort of organize how work is delegated or distributed. And that's why people now have an option to work from home. It may vary from industry to industry, but I think for most industries, if you're not a frontline worker or in the service industry, there is some flexibility whereby you're able to have those flexible work arrangements and work from home. But that also means that work-life bit becomes blurred. So the question for us is, instead of work-life balance, I think what people are thinking about is work-life harmony. Because if the lines are blurred, then where does one start and where does the other end, right? And how do you then have kind of a seamless arrangement between work, life, and maintain your sanity through it all and don't feel so stressed, right? I think it's a lot easier when you actually enjoy your work. I think you've often heard people say that if I'm enjoying my work, actually you don't really feel that, oh, I'm working now and then this is my life, as if my life was totally separate from my work. It would be great if everyone is working in an area or every aspect of your work so totally energizes you that you don't have difficulties going from work to life. Yeah. But for those of us who do not have that luxury, then I guess the question is, how do you then try to have this harmony? And I think this is where employers will have to play a role and be involved and be helpful. So for instance, should we have protected hours for employees? Because one of the downsides of flexible workplace arrangements is it's so flexible, you can have a meeting any time of the day and night. So this is what employees have surfaced through our public consultations on mental health. So I think employees value having protected time. They also value not being chased, in the sense that just because you are on flexible workplace arrangements and you are out of sight, sometimes employers try to overcompensate, by actually thinking that you should be at their beck and call, literally. Like if I call you, you should literally pick up your phone in like 10 seconds or something, because if you're at work, you'll be right in front of me, right? So, I think respecting boundaries, and this is how this was one of the points you raised, Theodoric, right at the start, pushing boundaries. Where are those boundaries? For employer versus employee, work versus life, working hours versus non-working hours. I think there still needs to be some level of boundaries so that people feel that I'm protected in a certain time, in a certain space. I have that agency and ability to have control over my time and my life. And I think that in itself is important because it's empowering. Oftentimes when people feel disempowered, that is when they feel the most disappointed, hopeless, helpless, stressed, and therefore suffer mentally. So the question is, how do you have your employee feel empowered, even as we go about flexible workplace arrangements? Some other feedbacks that we have heard have been around how can we have more empathetic conversations in the workplace. I had talked about the command control and the trust and inspire kind of leadership style, the difference between them. HR practices. I think employees often value openness when it comes to appraisals or talking about what is transpiring at work. If employers can also be a lot more open and a little bit more honest, and when having those discussions with the employees, I think it helps the employee know what is going right, what is going wrong, and where they should put their efforts. And I think that also helps with general productivity and their mental health. Some companies have also shared that they have really taken an active step forward, by bringing in sometimes talks during lunchtime. having employees, basically have certain, like a Friday, like an early day off on Friday, or go home and have dinner with your family Friday evenings, kind of thing. Family friendly practices that I think generally do help with happiness level, satisfaction levels of employees, and I think all that helps mental health. Thank you, Theo.
Thanks so much, Minister Tate. I think that's a great insight. Two key things to highlight, which I think stood out for me. It's work-life harmony. I think it's an amazing theme, and one that I know the government has brought up and is striving, which is really important. And the other point, it's on empowering team members, employees as well, to feel good, to do their best work and enjoy what they're doing as well. I think that's amazing. One final closing question, and this is more of a personal one, just to get a sense of how you think as well. So what is the one thing that you would personally encourage those tuning in from Singapore or anywhere across Asia or the world to start doing on the personal or professional life to create a more thriving environment for themselves or for those around them? What is one tip you have for them?
Thanks for that question, Dororik. I think we can all try to practice some self-care and do things that help us and make us generally feel more happy and satisfied as individuals. And it could be very simple things like getting adequate rest and sleep, having a hobby, something that takes your mind off work or takes you to a place that's not your workplace or your home. Perhaps it's a park or somewhere where you can listen to music. Something that's out of your daily grind, of your life, where you're able to have protected space and time for yourself. I believe that rest is so that you can walk the next 1,000 miles and also bring in your family members and your friends with you on that journey. I think people can be stronger and better when they are together with their loved ones. To not feel that you are alone, even though sometimes you may feel that that's the case, because there are people who care about you. And coming back to what I mentioned earlier, it's okay to reach out. It's only when you reach out that you'll discover how many people care for you, and you'll be very surprised.
That's really insightful. I think just to distill that into two key points, it is basically one big thing. It's basically setting time for your personal activities, your hobbies, and yourself. I think really relating towards the boundaries aspect for yourself. And the other key thing is to lean on your social circle around you, especially. I think not uncommon for people to not feel comfortable speaking, but as you just brought up, it's okay to actually share and speak up. And oftentimes people want to hear from you or what you're going through as well. So those are very, very important and insightful comments. Thanks so much, MOS. So that was an amazing session. Thank you so much again, Minister of State, for sharing your views on mental health and opening up Mental Festival Asia 2022. We'll conclude this session, but for everyone tuning in and listening, that was an amazing first session to kick off Mental Festival Asia. But we have got an amazing lineup of events coming up right after this session. So thank you all for tuning in and see you at the next session.
Thank you.